Okay, I thought it was time to shoot some new videos on War for America, new tutorials using the new components from Compass. Okay, let's begin with the setup. The political will marker, the British are at 2 and the Colonials are at 13 for the 13 colonies. The initiative, by default, we start off with the British doing the first impulse and the Colonials second. And the action pulse markers are in the 2 box. There are only 2 pulses on turn 1. Turn 1 is the spring of 1775. Okay, I've set up the action deck, taking out all 1776 and later cards. The Colonials have been dealt 3 cards on the bottom, and the British the 3 cards on the top. Now you'll notice the Colonials have a British event, which is of no use to them. So as per the action card rules, they may offer that card to the British. The British can take that card or decline. In this case, the British think that the Simcoe card is pretty good, so they will draw it into their hand. Now, having drawn it into their hands, they have to discard 1 card. And since they don't think there'll be much fighting in 1775, they decide to get rid of the battle card. The battle card goes into the discard pile, and the Colonial player is now allowed to take every place in the cards to fulfill his hand of 3. He draws the Daniel Morgan card, and now, of course, both sides have a legal 3-card hand. Now, for the purposes of the video, of course, the Colonial player, the British player, would not know what the other player has. As I mentioned, turn 1 only has 2 action pulses. So we move the British action pulse marker down 1 to indicate that he is moving first, like so. So the British will take the first action pulse, and the most logical thing to do is to move your reinforcements in first. On turn 1, the British have 2 British regulars coming from the Europe box, along with Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne as 2-star generals. So they'll take their turn by rolling the die, and their destination is Boston. If they roll anything but a 1, they will arrive at Boston. Okay, they roll a 5, which is more than enough to get to Boston. And they move like so. 1, 2. Now they have movement points remaining, and when you land from overseas, you have 1 movement point that you can move inland. But there's no real place for them to go. They could chance a move and go to Rhode Island, I suppose. But I don't know if they should take that chance this early in the game. Yeah, you know, what the heck. Sure, let's try it. Now, Boston always has to be occupied by 4 factors. That's allowed. So, we'll leave Clinton and Burgoyne behind, and Howe, with 2 British regulars, will move on Rhode Island. Now we have some calculations to do. Now, it looks like a fairly simple move, but there's a lot of things going on here. For example, the British outnumber the Colonials 2-1, so that automatically gives them a +1. Howe alone is an A-class leader. He's adding 3, so I'd be adding 4 to the dice. On top of that, British regulars against militia adds another 1, so I'd be adding 5 to the dice. It would be rather silly for the Colonials to try and fight Howe at this location, so they'll attempt a retreat before combat, and since they have no leader present, they will only succeed by rolling a 1 or 2. Let's see what happens. They roll a 4, so they cannot retreat before combat. We now have our first combat with the odds heavily against the Colonials. Now in all combats, both players roll the dice. So we roll the dice, and the British are adding 5. So the British end up with a 15, and the Colonials actually end up with a 6, because remember they were minusing 1. So they get a no result, and the British, of course, get a 1 result, destroying the militia unit. So Howe is left in possession of Newport, Rhode Island. Now, because Rhode Island only consists of the Portsmouth space, the British have captured Rhode Island, and thus the political will for the Colonials goes down 1, and the political will for the British goes up 1. And that is the British action pulse for turn 1. The Colonials take their action pulse, put it down 1, and let's see what they can do. One of the logical moves that the Patriots can do is to get Ethan Allen to capture Fort Ticonderoga. So let's see if Allen can do that. He will roll for his initiative. His initiative is 5. So he rolls a 4, which means he can move. You have to roll 5 or less. And there's only 2 movement points to get to Ticonderoga. So here we have Ethan Allen on top of Ticonderoga. Now this simple situation actually introduces a lot of moves. There are 3 options for Allen, 2 of them which aren't very good. Number 1, since it's a control space, notice the little key, Allen can do nothing. Just stay on the space, and in a sort of besiege thing, just watch over Ticonderoga. But that's rather useless. His second option normally would be to overrun the place. He does have 8-to-1 odds, and 8-to-1 odds usually overruns a place. However, Ticonderoga is a fortress, so fortresses cannot be overrun. That leaves Allen with his last choice, and the choice that he will choose. That's to assault the fortress. One thing you can do if you're pressed for space, not so much here, but in other situations, just put a battle marker down here on the Ticonderoga space and move the troops to a more congenial spot on the board. Okay, so notice the modifiers here. Allen will be assaulting Ticonderoga, although it's only got a garrison of a quarter strength point. And the modifiers are -3 when you assault a fortification. But odds matter too, and he has odds of greater than 4-to-1, and therefore he adds 3. So they cancel out. So like the other combat, both players will be rolling a dice. And even though it's a fortress, garrisons always fight on the petite guerre table. So they're on this less than 1 table, while Allen will be on this 2 table. We'll roll 2 dice, see what happens. Okay. Well, Allen rolls an 11, which easily takes the place, gets a 1 result against the garrison, killing it. And the British get a 4, which is no result. So Allen takes Ticonderoga. Now it may not look like much, but actually it's much greater than it looks. Allen's now in command of Ticonderoga, and he's in a 2. So anybody trying to assault him will have -3 to the dice. And up here at Saint Jean is only a garrison. Also at Montreal is a garrison. Now you've got Carleton at Quebec with 1 regular and 1 loyalist. So it doesn't look good for the British. The Colonials are off to a nice start. Okay, each side has 1 action pulse left, and we have to roll to see who goes first. We roll, and this time the Colonials go first. So we reverse these markers, showing that the Colonials move first and the British second. And since the Colonials are moving now, they'll burn up this action pulse marker and put it at 0. So now the Colonials move. Now the Colonials have their work cut out for them. Allen could do a very risky move and move on Saint Jean, assaulting the fort. Not great odds. Or they could move Arnold up. That'll take at least another pulse or 2 to get there. Or they could splinter off some of the men from this militia. But even then, they would only garrison Ticonderoga while Allen went forward. All the options are kind of risky. Okay, the Colonials decide to do a risky move. They're going to splinter off 2 militia from Worcester to march up to Ticonderoga. They have to roll a die, and when you roll a die moving with no leader, you subtract 2 from the dice. They roll a 1, which is the worst they could have got. Now when that happens, you always get one movement point, always. So the 2 militia march to Northfield and stop. And that's the Colonial turn. The British now take their action pulse, and that will end the turn. What can the British do? The British have to maintain a garrison of 4 at Boston, so there's not a lot they can do there. I think the best move for them would be to move Johnson up the St. Lawrence and reinforce Fort St. Jean. So that's what they'll do. Johnson states that his objective is St. Jean, and then he rolls for his initiative. He rolls a 3, which means he can move. And we'll see a new rule at place here. Movement is 4, as we know. 1, 2, 3, 4. But when you move entirely by water, you can move 1 extra space. So Johnson will move to St. Jean by water. That's the British turn. St. Jean looks a bit healthier now. And that ends entirely turn 1. The early spring turn. The next phase is the administration phase, but there's not much to do there except move the season marker to early summer. So we're at a brand new turn, and we'll set the action pulse markers way back up the top. 4 potential action pulse markers or pulses this turn, and we're going to be rolling to see who goes first. We roll, and the Colonials go first. So we keep the markers there. Colonials, then the British. Now the first thing you should do when it's your turn is check for reinforcements. And sure enough, Putnam, Thomas, and Ward appear in the leader pool. And then you've got an optional reinforcement here, which most people would take. Makes sense to do so. You get to add a Continental regular, and then you just move Benedict Arnold to Fort Halifax in New England, if Benedict Arnold is in New England or the Middle States, which 99% of the time he is. So that's what we'll do. Those 3 leaders into the leader pool, and Arnold and 1 Continental arrive at Fort Halifax. There we have the 3 leaders in the Colonial leaders box. And for those of you who are wondering, what about Arnold? Yes, just do what it says. Physically pick up Arnold and move him to Fort Halifax. In this case, Arnold happened to be at New London. Just pick him up and move him to Fort Halifax. Now the Colonial reinforcements are on the board. Okay, the Colonials have a few options here. Allen is a 2, but pretty iffy to take Fort St. Jean. He really should wait for these reinforcements that came up from Worcester. They got a bad roll last time, so maybe that won't happen again. Now Arnold is very valuable. He's +3 and he's on a Continental. So having Arnold rendezvous with Ethan Allen is certainly a good option too. Let's ponder. Yeah, I think Arnold moving across to join south of or north of Ticonderoga is the best option. So Arnold will roll for his initiative. He's a 5. Only a 6 would he be failing. He got a 2, therefore he can move his 4 movement points. It's 2 movement points to Northumberland and 2 to Valcour. So Arnold is there with 1 Continental regular, just north of Ethan Allen's force at Ticonderoga. And we move the Colonial marker down 1 pulse to show they've taken their pulse. Now it's the British player's turn, or pulse for that turn. Always check your reinforcement card first, and sure enough, the British get 2 British regulars, and their destination is Boston. So we put them in the From Europe box and roll to see how far they get. Now you don't have to move your reinforcements first, but it's optimal to do so, because when your reinforcements land, then your land forces that are already at the destination can decide where they want to go. So we roll the die for those British reinforcements. And to go to Boston, anything but a 2 is fine. they roll a 5. So they go 1 and 2, and they've landed at Boston. They have 1 movement point left, which means Gage's disposable force now is effectively, 2 or 3 movement points. It's still not great, but still an option for General Gage. Okay, the Canada front is still not looking great. I'm inclined to move some regulars under Carleton down to the fort or down to Montreal, but I think instead I'm going to try a naval transport move of this regular from Halifax to Quebec. So he's moving by sea, we roll the die, and that's how many movement points he gets. And he gets 3 movement points, which is enough. Halifax to the St. Lawrence box is 1, and he lands at Quebec 2. So Carleton's force looks a lot better now. Canada is defended. Again, we move the action pulse marker to remind us that the British have taken their turn. So we now roll again to see who goes first in the next action pulse. Okay, the British roll a 6, Colonial's a 3. So we reverse these markers. The British are now moving first. Reminder, move your action pulse marker down. So the British now move. Okay, I may regret this, but I'm going to try a risky move here. We have to leave 4 at Boston, so I'm going to leave Gage and Burgoyne. They've got the fleet there, they're entrenched. They should be okay. I'm going to splinter off Clinton, 1 Tory, and 2 British regulars. And their destination is going to be New London, Connecticut. So Clinton will roll for his initiative. Okay, Clinton is rolling for his initiative. He rolls a 4, his initiative is 5, so he's okay. So he moves through Newport 1 and to New London 2. Now he outnumbers the militia by 3 to 1, and he's got regulars. If I was the militia, I'd try to get out. So that's what they'll try to do. Retreat for combat, they would need a 1 or a 2. They do. So they retreat. I think they'll go upstream here to Hartford. Now, because they retreated before combat, Clinton could continue his movement. But I think he's quite content to stay there. He actually has 2 movement points left. But I don't think he wants to go any further. Of course, he could pursue them up to Hartford, too. I think Clinton will just stay there. Now, when Clinton moved, he did have 2 movement points left over. Now, the rules state that you must state your destination. You don't have to deal out exactly what each commander is doing. His destination was New London, and he made it. But he had 2 movement points left, so technically he could put an entrenchment up there, and that is allowed. You don't have to state what the force is doing, just its destination. So that's the British move. And now it would be the Colonial action pulse. Always keep in mind that during any of those action pulses, I could have used an action card. But I didn't feel I needed one. Action cards, don't squander them. Good idea. Keep them when you really need them. Now, if you're pressed, like the British nearly were, I nearly wanted to use that John Graves Simcoe card. The Americans might want to use the Daniel Morgan card. Not sure. Let's take a look at some of the Colonial options. Now, looking at the Patriot cards, yeah, they have got a battle card, good for attacking, extended march. They don't really need them that much, at least not at this stage. They've got Daniel Morgan, but keep in mind that Daniel Morgan is a continental leader, and technically he can only be placed on a square with continentals. And the only square that has continentals right now is Arnold, way up at Valcourt. And it's not a good idea having a leader running around on a 1 all by itself, because if the 1 is destroyed, the leader is destroyed. So that's, I would keep Morgan in the Patriot hand for now. Okay, I see one move here for Arnold, and that could really pay dividends if it worked, but it is risky. He could march back to Ticonderoga, picking up one militia strength point, then marching with his Continental and the militia onto Saint-Jean. He'd be adding 3 to the dice for his leadership, and that's worth something. It's a very bold move, and it's the kind of move that Arnold might do himself. He also could take Montreal, which might freak out the British. Let's examine the odds and decide what Arnold will do. Okay, Arnold is going to march back to Ticonderoga, pick up 1 militia strength point, leaving Allen there, and he's going to march directly on to Montreal. It's the Liddell-Hart approach to things, the indirect approach. Now, garrisons can't retreat, so we're going to have a combat there at Montreal. Let's see how it works out. Okay, it's still a pretty good battle. Arnold has the odds, so he gets the +3, plus he's an A-class leader, another 3, that's +6. But even though it's just a garrison, they still get the benefit of the entrenchments. So Arnold will be adding 5 to the dice. Here we go. Well, we kind of expected that. Adding 5 to the dice certainly kills the garrison. The garrison got an 8, which is 1 star. So Montreal is captured by Arnold. At this point, it might be worthwhile to point out the supply line rules. Arnold is still in supply because he has a supply line back to Albany. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The only thing that blocks supply lines are garrison counters and SP. So even though that's a red spot, it does not block his supply line. Rolling once again for initiative. And it's a tie. Now, a new rule comes into place when you roll a tie. Okay, when you roll a tie, each player draws 1 action card. So it doesn't matter who draws first. So I'll have the British player draw an action card, and he gets extended march. And the Colonial draws an action card, and he gets battle card. Now you're only allowed to have 3 cards in your hand, so each player must discard 1 card. So he has a hand of 3 again. So that's one of the reasons why you should use some cards, so you never have to discard. But you don't want to waste them. Well, the Colonial player in this case doesn't need 2 battle cards, so he'll discard that. The British, he doesn't need extended march cards double, so he'll extend that. That ends the card phase part of the pulse. Now, when you roll that tie, you just do what the rule says. And the rule says, the player who won the initiative from the previous turn takes 1 action point, pulse, followed by his opponent's action pulse. Now the action cycle is over. So when you roll a tie, the turn can be short. Who won the action phase last time? It was the British. So we put this down here, because they're only going to take 1. The British are going to move, and the Colonials are going to move, and then the turn ends. And as you can see, what if this marker had been way up here at 4 and you've rolled a tie? The turn would be a lot shorter. That's what can make the game long or short. If you keep rolling ties, the game will be shorter, and that mitigates against the British. The British need time. So the British will take an action pulse, the Colonials will take an action pulse, and the entire turn for 1776 early summer will be over. Okay, Arnold's action at Montreal has caused a bit of a panic for the British. So they are going to use one of their cards. They're going to use John Graves Simcoe. Simcoe must be added to a loyalist force, which he will, and he'll add to the loyalist forces at Quebec, which means they're a +1 in combat. So that certainly strengthens Quebec in case Arnold has any designs against the city. Note also that playing of an action card does not constitute your pulse. Playing of a card is a free action. So, the British still have their action pulse to do. What do they do? Well, I don't like it too much, but the fort at Saint-Jean is rather isolated now, as Arnold could get in their rear and begin to cut them off. So I think probably want to evacuate the fort. Let's see the options. Yes, I think it's time to evacuate Fort Saint-Jean. Now, forts can be destroyed voluntarily at any time during a player's action phase, as long as no enemy forces are on the space. So they will destroy Fort Saint-Jean, and Johnson will attempt to move out of Saint-Jean. He'll have to roll his action, his command value, and he rolls a 6, which means he does not. This is the first time we've had a leader fail his action roll. What are the consequences of that? Now, when a leader fails his action roll, he gets 2 movement points instead of 4. That's not serious for Johnson because it's only 2 movement points to Quebec. So Johnson will fall back, the garrison comes off the board, and falls back on Carleton at Quebec. Now Quebec is fairly impregnable, and that will end the British pulse. Well, the late summer turn is coming up next turn, so the Colonials don't want to waste any militia because all of those militia units are going to be converted to Continental regulars. So it would be foolish to do a risky move now and have militia destroyed. The Colonials don't have to win in 1775, and it's nearly impossible for the British to do so. So why risk it? So I think the Colonials will just do a very conservative move and reinforce Allen from Northfield. So that's leaders are forces moving without a leader. They roll a die and subtract 2. They roll a 6, which means they get 4 movement points, which is plenty. 1, 2, and 3. Ethan Allen is reinforced at Ticonderoga. And that ends the early summer turn of 1775. That might be a good point to halt the video now, part 1 of the tutorial. When we begin, we'll be doing the late summer turn of 1775. Much will happen then. So thank you for watching part 1.